A forgotten map holds the truth about a lost civilization. Elara was a young cartographer living a quiet life until she discovered a fragmented chart hidden in her family's belongings. This was no ordinary map. It pointed toward the entrance of the legendary Dwarven Deep Roads, a network of subterranean kingdoms swallowed by time. The legends spoke of immense halls and forgotten technologies, but they also warned of collapse and hidden dangers. Driven by a need to prove these stories were real and to uncover a legacy her own family had lost, Elara made a choice that would change everything. She left her safe world behind, risking her reputation and her very life on a sliver of parchment and a whisper of a dream. By the end of her story, you will understand how a single discovery can rewrite history and reveal secrets that were meant to stay buried forever. We will uncover what caused a mighty civilization to vanish and what waits for those brave enough to seek its heart. Where are you listening from right now, and what is the local time where you are? I always find it wonderful to hear how far these stories can travel. What would you be willing to risk to learn a truth the world has forgotten? The mountain itself seemed determined to betray her. Each step Elara took sent a cascade of pebbles skittering into the abyss. The sound multiplied and twisted by the wind-scoured walls of the Whispering Pass. The map warned of this place, not with words, but with a series of delicate, intersecting lines that depicted the acoustic traps. A shout from the wrong ledge could trigger a rock slide. A foot placed on a seemingly stable stone could send her tumbling into the gorge below. She moved with a painful slowness, her body pressed against the cold rock, her eyes constantly darting between the treacherous path and the fragile parchment in her hand. The cryptic symbols were her only lifeline, indicating a route that defied logic, where the safest path often looked like the most dangerous. Trusting the map meant ignoring the terrified screaming of her own instincts. It was a choice between a wider, inviting ledge and a narrow, crumbling crack the map insisted was correct. She chose the crack, her pack scraping loudly against the stone. The moment she was clear, a low rumble echoed through the pass as the inviting ledge she had rejected shattered and fell away into the mist. The relief was short-lived. The vibration from the collapse dislodged a heavy stone above her, which struck her pack with a sickening tear. The straps snapped, and she could only watch, helpless, as the bag containing most of her food and her extra warm clothing plunged into the depths. A cold that had nothing to do with the mountain air settled deep within her. Now she stood on a small, precarious outcrop, the worst of the pass behind her, but her situation more dire than ever. She could turn back. The descent would be even more perilous with weakened limbs from hunger, but it was a known danger. Or she could press forward into the unknown with little more than the water in her flask and the clothes on her back. The map, now proven terrifyingly accurate, felt heavier in her hand. It was no longer just a guide to a legend. It was a chain, pulling her toward a truth that was demanding a higher and higher price. The pursuit of a forgotten world suddenly felt less like a scholarly quest and more like a fight for survival. She took a slow, steadying breath, the taste of dust and decision on her tongue, and moved forward. Her boots finally found solid, level ground. The oppressive, echoing narrows of the pass opened into a sheltered stone basin. Brushing aside a thick curtain of thorny vines, her fingers found not more rough stone, but something smooth and intricately carved. It was an archway, its edges worn soft by centuries of weather, but the patterns were unmistakably deliberate. This was not a natural formation. This was made. The sheer weight of the discovery stole her breath. The legends were not just stories whispered in dusty libraries. They were real, and she was standing at their doorstep. The archway was merely a prelude to the true guardian of this place. There, half swallowed by a thicket of gnarled mountain roots and creeping moss, stood a statue. It was colossal, carved from the same dark granite as the mountain itself, a dwarf warrior in full, formidable armor. Time had smoothed the finer details of its face, but its stance was unmistakable. One hand rested on the pommel of a great stone axe, while the other was raised, palm outward in a gesture of eternal warning. The air grew still and heavy around it. This was no simple marker. It was a sentinel, and it blocked the way to a seamless section of the cliff face that could only be a concealed door. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic counter rhythm to the profound silence. The answer had to be on the statue itself. She approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the weathered stone, and there, carved into the broad base, she found them. Runes. They were not the common dwarven script she had studied in archives. This was a more ancient, angular language, a cipher of deep history. Her fingers traced the grooves, feeling the intention and power locked within the stone. The puzzle was a sequence, a story told in symbols, a forging hammer, a falling tear, a crown, and a shattered anvil. It was a narrative of creation, loss, rule, and downfall. She had to press them in the correct order, but which told the true story of this place? Was it the pride of creation first, or the grief of loss? Her mind raced, piecing together the fragments of lore she had collected. The legends always spoke of a great cataclysm that ended the Golden Age. The fall came before the broken crown. It had to be the hammer of creation, then the tear of sorrow, then the shattered anvil of their industry's end, and finally, the lonely crown of a lost kingdom. Taking a steadying breath, she pressed the cold stone symbols in that sequence. For a long, terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then, a deep, resonant click echoed from within the mountain, a sound that had not been heard for 1,000 years. The raised palm of the statue slowly lowered, and with a grinding roar that shook the very ground beneath her feet, a massive section of the cliff slid inward, revealing a yawning, dark opening and a steep stairway that descended into the earth. The triumph was instantly eclipsed by a new sound, a heavy, scraping drag from the thicket behind her. Something large was moving, drawn by the noise of the awakening gate. She felt its presence more than saw it, a primal dread coiling in her stomach. She stood at the threshold, the open darkness before her, and an unknown threat at her back. To flee was to be hunted in the open mountains, exhausted and without supplies. To enter was to trust that the legends of her family and the accuracy of her map would lead her to safety, not a tomb. The scraping sound grew closer, accompanied by a low, guttural breathing. There was no more time. With a final glance at the fading daylight, Elara plunged into the darkness. The moment she crossed the threshold, the great stone door groaned and began to grind shut, sealing her in with a final, deafening thud. The world outside, with its dangers and its light, was gone. Absolute, suffocating blackness pressed in on all sides. Yet, as she stood there trembling, a faint, cool breath of air brushed against her face. It carried the scent of ancient stone and vast, empty spaces. It was a draft from the depths, a silent promise that the deep roads were waiting. The darkness was absolute, a physical weight against her eyes. Elara fumbled with her tinderbox, her hands trembling in the profound silence, until a small flame caught, and she lit her lantern. The warm, golden light pushed back the void, revealing the top of a stairway so vast its bottom was lost in shadow. Each step was carved from a single block of stone, worn smooth in the center by countless feet over millennia. As she descended, the air grew colder and carried the scent of deep earth and ages long past. The stairs opened into a hall of impossible scale, its ceiling lost in darkness high above. And there, covering every inch of the towering walls, were the murals. Her breath caught. This was not just a tunnel. It was a library of stone, a history book written by the hands of a lost people. The first panels glowed with vibrant colors, depicting the dwarves in their prime. They forged rivers of molten metal, built cities that glittered with gemstones, and raised kings and queens upon thrones of polished obsidian. It was a golden age of unity and staggering achievement, but the story shifted as she moved further into the hall. The colors grew darker, the scenes more somber. She saw a great council, dwarf lords arguing over a glowing, star-shaped object at its center. Then came the schism. The murals showed the single, glorious kingdom fracturing into rival clans, their once shared forges going cold as they turned their engineering genius against one another. The artifact, once a symbol of unity, was now a prize to be fought over, its power seemingly twisting ambition into outright war. This was the true collapse. It was not a sudden invasion or a natural disaster, but a slow, bitter poison brewed from within. The final panels in the sequence were stark and haunting. They showed the deep roads not as thriving arteries, but as sealed tombs. Great gates were shut, and the last dwarves were depicted walking away from their magnificent halls into the upper world, their postures heavy with a grief that transcended time. The silence in the hall was no longer empty. It was filled with the echoes of that final, tragic exodus. Elara felt a new, urgent purpose crystallize. Her quest was no longer just about proving the legends true. It was about the artifact, the Star Heart. The murals suggested it was not destroyed, but hidden, and that it held the potential to reunite the shattered legacy of its creators. She stood at a crossroads, not of stone, but of history itself. Should she seek the cause of the collapse, or follow the thread of the artifact? To understand the end would be a scholar's victory, but to find the Star Heart felt like a chance to mend a broken world. The choice was made. She would hunt for the artifact, believing it was the key that could unlock the deepest secrets of the dwarves. Yet, a deep unease settled in her stomach as she looked again at the murals. The Star Heart was depicted with rays of light that could be interpreted as both benevolent warmth and destructive fire. Its power was clearly a double-edged sword, a blessing that had become a curse. Finding it might not just restore a forgotten history, it might awaken a force that the dwarves themselves had chosen to bury for a reason. As she turned from the main hall into a narrower corridor, her lantern light fell upon a final, smaller carving. It was a detailed illustration of the artifact itself, and at its center was a distinct, star-shaped key. Her blood ran cold. The shape was identical to a small, metallic heirloom she had carried since childhood, a family trinket she had never understood. Almost without thought, her hand went to the pouch at her belt, her fingers closing around the cold metal. The moment she touched it, a soft, resonant hum pulsed through her palm, a gentle vibration that had not been there before. The key was awake, and it was calling out to its other half from the depths of the dark. The cold metal hummed in her palm, a living vibration that resonated with the stone around her. Elara carefully drew the star-shaped pendant from its pouch, its simple lines suddenly seeming ancient and powerful. As she held it near the mural's depiction of the artifact, the pendant flared with a soft, white light. The carved star on the wall shimmered in response, and with a soft, gritty sound of shifting stone, a narrow slot opened beside it, revealing a cylindrical scroll case of tarnished metal. Her heart hammered as she carefully pulled it free. Inside was a sheet of beaten copper, etched not with a map, but with a flowing, poetic script. The words were a riddle, speaking of listening stones and a path lit by a fallen moon, a guide to the treacherous lower levels. But the moment the scroll left its resting place, a low, deep tremor ran through the floor, vibrating up through the soles of her boots. The tremor grew, a persistent grinding groan that echoed from the darkness ahead and behind. Small pebbles and a fine dust rained down from the ceiling. The chamber itself felt like a great beast, stirring from a long slumber, awakened and angered by her intrusion. Her actions had not just revealed a secret, they had triggered something. The dormant defenses of the Deep Roads were now actively hunting the intruder. She had a choice, a stark one made with the ground shaking beneath her. She could try to retreat, to run back the way she came, hoping the tremors would subside. Or she could trust this fragile, cryptic poem, a guide left by the very people who had built these traps, and press forward into the deepening chaos. To go back was to admit defeat and face an uncertain danger in the passages she had already disturbed. To go forward was to place her life in the hands of a 1,000-year-old poem. Her decision was swift. She would not retreat. Unrolling the copper scroll again, her eyes scanned the first stanza. It spoke of a guide that drinks no light, a pale glow in the deepest night. As the rumbling intensified, her panicked gaze swept the chamber and landed on a patch of faintly glowing blue fungus, clinging to the wall of a descending tunnel she had not noticed before. It was a path, a marker left by the ancients. It promised guidance, but it also led away from the main hall, down into a darkness that the murals had never depicted. The roads were no longer a silent tomb, but a living, breathing adversary, and her only weapon was a riddle in a language not her own. The faint blue glow of the fungus was her only compass in the suffocating dark. Elara moved cautiously, her boots testing each step on the crumbling floor of the narrow tunnel. The bioluminescent growth clung to the walls in winding veins, its pale light revealing jagged pitfalls and sections of unstable, gravel-strewn ground that would have sent her falling into nothingness. With one hand steadying herself against the cold stone, she used her other to quickly sketch the unusual species in her journal, noting its structure and the strange, cool scent it emitted. This was more than a path. It was a resource, a living guide left by the dwarves themselves. The tunnel twisted downward for what felt like an age, then abruptly opened into a staggering void. Her small sphere of light was swallowed by an immense cavern, so vast her lantern could not hope to illuminate its ceiling. The faint blue glow from the tunnel behind her was just enough to outline the silhouettes of a forgotten city. Stalls and stone counters lined wide avenues, their surfaces still holding the ghostly shapes of abandoned wares. This was a market, a place that once echoed with the life of a subterranean world. Then, without warning, the guiding fungus lining the cavern walls began to dim. Its light faded from a steady azure to a weak, flickering pulse, and then to near blackness. The darkness that rushed in was absolute and terrifying, and in that new silence, broken only by the frantic beat of her own heart, she heard it, a dry, skittering noise, like countless hard legs on stone, clicking from the cavern ceiling high above. She stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but to where? The path behind was a fragile thread, and the market ahead was an unknown maze of crumbling ruins. To hide and wait for the light to return was to be a stationary target for whatever was making that sound. Progress, however blind, was her only real choice. She had to keep moving. Sliding her journal back into her pack, she stretched her hands out, her fingers finding the rough-hewn wall beside her. She would use it as a guide, feeling her way forward one painstaking inch at a time. The skittering above seemed to multiply, echoing from all directions now, a chorus of unseen movement, tracking her slow progression through the ruins. Her shoulder brushed against a stone pillar, and she flinched, the sound unnaturally loud. Then her searching hand, sliding across the rock, found not more rough stone, but something smooth and cold. It was a lever, its surface intricately carved, set flush into the wall. There was no time for caution, no moment to debate its purpose. It was a choice, an action in a sea of paralyzing fear. She wrapped both hands around the cold metal and pulled with all her weight. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a great, grinding shriek of metal on stone that echoed through the cavern, a section of the floor directly before her dropped away, sliding into a hidden recess. A steep, polished ramp was revealed, angling down into a deeper darkness, one that smelled not of dust and decay, but of old incense and polished metal. The ramp deposited her into a chamber that stole all sound. This was the Hall of Ancestors, a space so immense her lantern light could not find its end. Lining the walls were towering statues of dwarf kings, each carved from a different, glittering stone, their stern faces weathered by time, but their postures still radiating an unyielding authority. Each monarch held a unique item, a crystal, a scroll, a sword, a hammer, and the sheer weight of their collective gaze was a palpable pressure in the still air. The copper scroll was her only guide, its riddle pointing to one king among many. It spoke of a ruler who bore the tool of foundation, the shaper of the mountain's heart. Her eyes darted from statue to statue, her mind racing through the lore. The king with the crystal could be a seer, the one with the sword, a warrior. But the tool of foundation, the shaper of the mountain, that had to be the hammer. It was a symbol of creation itself. With a decisive step, she approached the statue, holding a great stone hammer, and pressed her hand against the carved weapon. For a terrifying second, silence held. Then a low rumble answered, not from the statue before her, but from across the hall. The king holding the sword shifted on its plinth, grinding sideways with a roar of stone on stone to block the arched entrance she had used, sealing her in. The exit was gone. Panic clawed at her throat. She was trapped, and her first logical guess had been wrong. The hall was no longer a silent gallery. It was a prison of her own making. She could try another guess, rushing from statue to statue in a desperate gamble, but the consequence of another error was unthinkable. The entire chamber could collapse, or a worse trap could be sprung. She forced herself to breathe, to quiet the frantic beating of her heart. She had to learn from her mistake. Rushing had failed. Now she would observe. She moved slowly along the line of kings, not looking at the objects they held, but studying their faces, their stances, the intricate carvings on their armor and crowns. She realized each plinth was inscribed not with a name, but with a single, repeating symbol that matched the items in the murals from the great hall above. The king with the hammer was not the founder, he was the enforcer, his symbol, the shattered anvil of industry's end. The true tool of foundation was not about brute force, but about careful, deliberate creation. Her eyes fell upon a statue she had initially dismissed, a king carved of simple, unadorned granite. He held not a weapon or a jewel, but a masterfully carved mason's trowel. His plinth bore the symbol of the forging hammer, the very first rune from the gate puzzle, the beginning of everything. This was the true founder, the one who laid the first stone. She pressed her hand to the cool stone of the trowel. This time, the sound was different, a deep, resonant click that echoed with satisfying finality. A section of the wall behind the founder king slid inward, revealing a new passage. The stakes of this place were now brutally clear. Her journey was not just a physical one, it was a test of understanding. These kings were not merely memorials, they were the eternal guardians of the principles that built their civilization. And now, she understood, they were also the guardians of the artifact's scattered components. The new doorway did not lead to another tunnel, but opened directly onto a narrow stone bridge, arching over a profound darkness. A cold, damp wind sighed up from the abyss below, tugging at her clothes. And there, across the chasm, illuminated by a faint, ethereal glow from some unseen source, was a structure that made her breath catch. It was a vast, circular forge, its architecture speaking of a purpose far greater than mere metalwork. This had to be the place the scroll called the Forge of Unity, the heart of the mystery, and it was calling her forward. The bridge was a skeletal remnant of its former self, a narrow spine of stone arching over an absolute darkness. A cold, howling wind surged from the abyss, pulling at her clothes and threatening her balance with every step. She moved with painstaking care, her arms outstretched, her boots finding purchase on crumbling stone and the occasional, terrifyingly narrow beam. The void below was a silent, hungry mouth. One misstep, one strong gust, and she would be gone forever. Midway across, the stone beneath her left foot crumbled without warning. A section of the bridge gave way with a roar of falling rock. Her stomach lurched as she fell, her hands scrabbling desperately at the edge. Her fingers caught a protruding stone, her body slamming hard against the cliff face. The impact jarred her pack loose, and she could only watch in horror as her journal, filled with all her sketches, translations, and personal reflections, tumbled away into the blackness, swallowed without a sound. The loss was a physical blow, a piece of her soul ripped away. Hanging there, suspended between the crumbling bridge and the endless drop, a stark choice presented itself. She could try to haul herself back to the relative safety of the hall she had left, defeated and broken. Or she could summon a strength she did not know she possessed and climb forward onto what remained of the bridge. Gritting her teeth, her muscles screaming, she pulled herself up, scraping her chest and legs on the rough stone until she collapsed, panting and trembling, on the solid portion of the span. There was no going back. Her proof was gone, her personal map erased. All she had left was the copper scroll and the memory of the path she had walked. She would have to trust them completely. On the other side, the entrance to the Forge of Unity was barred by a door of burnished metal, immense and seamless save for a complex lock of interlocking gears and crystalline levers. It was a puzzle of pure engineering, a final test of intellect before the heart of the mystery. There were no runes here, no poetic riddles, only the cold, hard logic of a machine that had not been touched in 1,000 years. The gearlock was a masterpiece of forgotten engineering, a constellation of interwoven brass and crystal set into the metal door. Elara's fingers hovered over the levers, her mind racing to decode the logic. The copper scroll spoke of a harmony of elements, a sequence of 3, and her pendant hummed with a soft, insistent warmth against her chest. She focused on the 3 central gears, each marked with a different symbol: fire, stone, and spirit. The riddle mentioned the breath of the mountain, giving life to the forge, stone first, to represent the foundation. She carefully rotated the stone-marked gear until it clicked into place. Then fire, to represent the transformative power. Finally, spirit, the unseen will that binds it all. As the spirit gear aligned, the entire mechanism flared with a brief blue light. With a deep, resonant hum, the massive door slid sideways into the wall, retracting with a smooth, silent motion that felt unnerving after so much grinding stone. The silence was broken instantly. From deep within the corridors behind her, the sound of the door's movement echoed, a clear signal of intrusion that was answered by a distant, guttural roar. Something knew she was here. The choice was immediate and critical. She could try to find a way to seal the door, securing her position, but trapping herself inside a potential tomb. Or she could leave it open, preserving a line of retreat into the treacherous but known deep roads. Her heart pounded, a frantic drum against her ribs. Survival outweighed security. She left the doorway open, a gaping maw of darkness that now felt like a two-way street for danger. Stepping across the threshold, the atmosphere shifted completely. The air was warm and carried the sharp scent of ozone and the deep, metallic tang of old iron, as if a great storm had been captured inside the mountain long ago. The Forge of Unity was a circular chamber, its domed ceiling alive with veins of softly glowing crystal that converged above a central dais. There, bathed in a single, brilliant shaft of light, rested an anvil of pure, dark obsidian. It was not a tool for hammering metal, but a sacred altar. The light from above played across its flawless surface, hinting at a dormant energy waiting for a catalyst. This was the heart of the mystery, the place where the star heart was either created or contained. The sheer, silent power of the room was overwhelming, a physical weight pressing down on her. But the open door at her back was a constant reminder of the fragile nature of this discovery. The peace was an illusion. The hunt was on, and she was now both the hunter and the hunted, standing at the precipice of a power that had shattered a civilization. The obsidian anvil felt neither cold nor warm, but hummed with a deep, resonant stillness. Driven by an instinct she could not name, Elara lifted the star-shaped pendant from her neck and placed it gently upon the dark, flawless surface. The moment the metal touched the stone, the chamber erupted into light. The crystalline veins in the dome above blazed with a fierce, white radiance, and from their focal point, a three-dimensional map of the entire Deep Roads network shimmered into existence above the anvil. It was a breathtaking vision of a lost world, a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers rendered in shimmering blue light. Yet, the map was incomplete. 3 points glowed with a distinct, angry red, scattered across the vast subterranean landscape like bleeding wounds. One pulsed in a place labeled the Cavern of Echoing Stone, another in the Sunken Foundry, and a third in the Chasm of Whispers. These were not just locations, they were the scattered components of the Star Heart. The truth was staggering. The artifact was not a single object to be found, but a shattered legacy to be painstakingly reassembled. As the hologram burned its details into her mind, she felt a sudden, sickening emptiness in her hand. She looked down. The pendant, which had hummed with life for so long, was now a dull, gray lump of metal. Its connection to this place, the very power that had guided her, was spent. It felt like losing a companion, a part of her own history now rendered inert and useless. The task ahead was no longer a quest. It was a trial of 3 parts, each one a journey into a different kind of danger. She studied the map, her eyes darting between the 3 red beacons. The Sunken Foundry promised ancient technology, but its path was long and crossed through areas, the map marked with symbols of structural collapse. The Chasm of Whispers was the farthest, a journey that felt like a lifetime away, but the Cavern of Echoing Stone was the closest. It was a tangible, immediate goal. A small victory here could provide the momentum she desperately needed, a shred of confidence to carry into the greater darkness that lay beyond. The choice was made. She would start with the Echo Cavern, as the holographic map flickered and died, plunging the chamber back into its eternal twilight. A new sound invaded the silence. From the dark tunnel that, according to the map, led toward her chosen destination, a low, rhythmic pounding began to echo. Boom, boom, boom. It was not the chaotic grind of a rock slide or the skittering of some unseen creature. This was a deliberate, percussive beat, a sound that resonated deep in her bones. It felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like a heartbeat, a slow, patient drumming from the depths of the mountain itself, calling her forward. The rhythmic pounding faded into a new, unsettling silence as she entered the Cavern of Echoing Stone. The air itself felt thick and heavy, seeming to swallow the light from her lantern. Her first, cautious footstep did not produce a simple tap. It bloomed into a cascade of sound, a soft scuff, multiplying into a chorus of shifting gravel that echoed for what felt like a full minute, bouncing off unseen walls and a ceiling lost to darkness. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest, until the last reverberation died away into an even deeper quiet. To move here was to create a storm of noise. Before her, the cavern was a forest of stone pillars, some slender and delicate, others thick and imposing, but all looking precariously balanced. A single loud noise, she realized, could bring the entire fragile ecosystem of stone crashing down. Her objective was clear. Across the cavern, Perched on a high, isolated ledge, a crystalline shard caught the weak light, glinting with a faint, internal blue fire. The first component. To reach it, she would have to become a ghost. She began to move with an agonizing slowness she had not thought possible, placing each foot with deliberate care, rolling from heel to toe to minimize the scrape of leather on stone. The sounds she did make were small, controlled, and she quickly learned to use them. A soft tap on a stable-looking pillar sent a wave of echoes ahead of her, briefly outlining the path in sound, revealing a patch of loose scree she would have otherwise stumbled into. She was not just moving through the cavern, she was conducting it, using its own dangerous nature as her guide. After what felt like an age, she reached the base of the ledge. It was too smooth to climb. She would have to create a distraction, a sound in one place to mask the necessary noise of her ascent here. Taking a deep, silent breath, she picked up a small pebble and tossed it gently toward a distant, sturdy-looking column. The resulting clatter was immense, a rolling thunder of noise that filled the cavern. In that precious window of sonic chaos, she braced her hands and feet against the rock and scrambled up, her movements swift and sure. Her fingers closed around the cold, smooth surface of the shard. A surge of triumph washed through her, so potent she almost forgot where she was. Almost. As she tucked the shard safely into her pouch, her boot dislodged a single, fist-sized stone. It seemed to fall in utter silence for a heart-stopping moment before it struck the ground below. The impact was a gunshot. The sound exploded, magnified 100-fold by the cavern's perfect acoustics. It rolled and built upon itself, a deafening roar that shook the very air. Above her, she heard the sharp, terrible crack of stressed rock. A massive pillar near the entrance she had used shuddered, then collapsed, taking a large section of the cavern wall with it in a torrent of dust and falling stone. When the last rumble faded, the way she had come was gone, sealed behind a mountain of fresh rubble. The triumph of the shard vanished, replaced by the cold, sharp reality of being entombed. The cavern felt smaller now, the echoes taking on a mocking, predatory quality. Every tiny sound she made, the rustle of her clothing, the shudder of her own breath, seemed to whisper back at her, reminding her of her solitude and her precarious situation. She could wait in the stifling silence, hoping for a miracle, or she could use the very thing that trapped her to find a way forward. Claustrophobia pressed in on her, a tightness in her chest that threatened to spiral into panic. She chose to fight it with action. Standing perfectly still in the center of the cavern, she took a controlled, sharp breath and clapped her hands together once. The sound was catastrophic, a shockwave that mapped the entire space in her mind. The returning echoes painted a picture of the cavern's dimensions, the placement of the pillars, and, most importantly, one anomaly. From a fissure in the far wall, the sound did not return a sharp, solid slap. It returned muted, distorted, and carried on its tail, and was the faintest sigh of moving air. A draft. Where there is a draft, there is a passage. The way out was not behind her, but ahead, deeper into the mountain's heart. The fissure was a tight, crushing squeeze, the stone scraping against her shoulders as she forced her way through. The moment she emerged, the whispers began. They were not echoes of her own movement, but 1,000 overlapping voices emanating from the walls themselves. The tunnel here was lined with a smooth, dark stone that seemed to absorb the light from her lantern. and from it poured a fragmented, chaotic symphony of a lost civilization. She heard shouts of anger from long-dead councils, the ringing of hammers on anvils, and the sorrowful laments of a people watching their world fracture. The stones were not just whispering history, they were reliving it. One voice, clear and sharp above the others, cut through the noise, a warning carved into the very air. The heart sees the forge of your intent. It answers ambition with ruin and greed with ash. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. This was not a simple treasure hunt. The artifact was a judge, and it would test the one who sought to wield it. But the cacophony was a relentless assault. The whispers began to coil around her own thoughts, blurring the line between memory and hallucination. She saw flashes of dwarf lords, corrupted by the very power they sought to control, their great halls crumbling not from outside force, but from the rot of their own poisoned desires. A sharp, throbbing pain built behind her eyes, and the walls seemed to pulse in time with the maddening chorus. She could block it out. She could press her hands over her ears and run, fleeing this psychic torment into whatever silence lay ahead. But to do so would be to ignore the very warnings that could save her life, or worse, prevent a cataclysm. Gritting her teeth against the disorientation, she forced herself to listen, to sift through the noise for precious fragments of truth. The effort was exhausting, each word a weight on her soul. Yet, from the turmoil, one phrase emerged repeatedly, a constant refrain beneath the anger and grief. Only the essence untainted by covetous fire may grasp the star without being burned. A pure heart. The requirement was not about bloodline or knowledge, but something far more personal and terrifying. It was a test of her own motivations. Was her quest truly for understanding and restoration, or was it, buried deep beneath the scholarly intent, a desire for the power and recognition such a discovery would bring? The question unsettled her more than any physical danger. The tunnel ended abruptly at a dark, vertical shaft. Cool, damp air washed over her face, a small mercy after the oppressive whispers. Ancient metal rungs, pitted with rust but still firm, were set into the stone, descending into darkness, and from far below, a new sound drifted up, faint but unmistakable, the steady, gentle rush of flowing water. It was a sound of life, of movement, a promise that the mountain still held secrets beyond haunted tunnels and psychological trials. But as she gripped the first cold rung and began her descent, leaving the whispers behind, the new question echoed louder in the silence of her own mind. Was her heart pure enough to bear the weight of the star, or was she, like the lords of old, simply forging her own path to ruin? The descent was a slow, cold pilgrimage into the mountain's belly. Each rusted rung groaned under her weight, and the whispering stone gave way to a deep, resonant roar that grew with every step downward. Finally, her boots met a solid, sandy shore. Before her stretched a vast subterranean river, its black water moving with a powerful, silent swiftness, its far shore lost in shadow. The air was thick with a fine, cold mist, and the thunderous sound came from somewhere downstream, a constant reminder that time was not on her side. The second component, according to the map in her mind, was on a small island she could just make out in the center of the torrent. To reach it, she needed a boat. Her lantern revealed a graveyard of old construction along the bank, splintered timber beams and petrified logs, remnants of a forgotten dwarven dock. She worked with a frantic, focused energy, dragging the least waterlogged pieces to the shore. Using cut lengths of vine and shredded fibers from her own worn clothing as lashings, she constructed a crude, unstable raft. It was a desperate patchwork of wood, but it would have to float long enough for a crossing and a return. Pushing the awkward vessel into the icy water, she used a long pole to navigate the current, fighting the river's pull with every muscle straining. The crossing was a battle of sheer will against the relentless flow, but she made it, scrambling onto the island's rocky perch. There, nestled in a natural stone bowl, was the second component, a smooth, dark metal orb that felt strangely warm to the touch. As her fingers closed around it, a soft chime seemed to resonate through the cavern, and the orb pulsed once with a deep, orange light, before settling into a gentle, internal warmth. 2 of 3, she was halfway there, but the river had other plans. The current, which had been strong before, now felt like a living thing awakening. The water surged, tugging at her makeshift raft with renewed fury. The distant roar became a deafening crash. She barely had time to shove off from the island before the raft was seized, spinning uncontrollably as it was swept downstream. The waterfall was no longer a distant threat. It was a visible horizon line where the world simply ended, a curtain of raging white water and spray. The shore was a blur of dark rock rushing past, too far for a safe swim in this torrent. She had one terrible choice: make a desperate leap for a jagged outcrop of rock now, or let the river make the choice for her at the precipice. There was no time to think, only to act. Abandoning the raft, she threw herself toward the rocks, her body slamming hard against the stone. Her hands scrabbled for purchase, fingers bleeding as she clung on, while the shattered pieces of her raft vanished over the edge into the roaring abyss. She lay there for a long moment, soaked, shivering, and bruised, the roar of the waterfall vibrating through her bones. Her transportation was gone, along with any easy path back. She was committed to moving forward, whatever that meant. Pushing herself up, she spotted a narrow, dry ledge running along the cavern wall, a path that had been invisible from the water. Following it, the spray from the waterfall soaked her anew, but as she moved behind the thundering curtain of water, she saw it. Carved into the rock face was an arched doorway, its edges worn smooth by millennia of mist, a silent invitation into the final leg of her impossible journey. The world behind the waterfall was a sanctuary of silence. Mist hung in the air like a breath held too long, and the roar of the cascade faded to a distant, rhythmic hum. The grotto was small, its curved walls blanketed in a soft, phosphorescent moss that cast a gentle green light over everything. In the very center, a single shaft of light from a crack in the ceiling high above illuminated a simple stone pedestal. Resting upon it was a gem, its facets capturing the faint glow and spinning it into 1,000 points of cool, white fire. This was the third component. It felt more like a holy relic than a piece of a machine. Her footsteps were whispers on the damp stone as she approached, a profound sense of trespass coiling in her stomach. This place was not meant for taking, it was meant for keeping. Yet her hand moved as if pulled by an invisible thread, her fingers closing around the smooth, cool crystal. The moment she lifted it, the grotto erupted. The moss on the walls blazed with emerald intensity, and the 3 components in her pouch awoke as one. A resonant vibration buzzed through her body, a harmonic chord struck deep within the mountain. The star shard, the warm orb, and the luminous gem hummed in perfect unison, their combined light bleeding through the leather in pulses of blue, orange, and white. It was a symphony of power, and she was its unwilling conductor. The sacred peace of the grotto shattered, replaced by the electric thrill of connection. She had done it. She had gathered the pieces, but the triumph was hollow, soured by the feeling that she had stolen something from a place of final rest. Did she have the right to reassemble a power that its creators had chosen to dismantle and hide? Her own ambition felt naked and dangerous under the grotto's accusing light. Exhaustion crashed over her in a heavy wave. Her body ached from the climb, her mind was frayed from the whispers, and her spirit was heavy with the weight of the decision. She could push on now, driven by the component's urgent call, but her steps would be those of a delirious fugitive, or she could do what felt, strangely, like the more courageous thing. She could stop. She sat at the base of the pedestal, placing the three glowing objects before her. She would not rush this. She would honor the silence of this place and use it to gather not just her physical strength, but her resolve. She ate the last of her meager rations, drank from a trickle of clean water seeping from the wall, and simply sat in the quiet hum of the artifacts, trying to quiet the louder hum of her own fears. When she stood again, her legs felt steadier, her mind clearer. The choice was reaffirmed. She would see this through, but she would carry the memory of this grotto's peace as a shield against the covetous fire the whispers had warned her about. As she stepped back through the waterfall, the world outside was transformed. The dark tunnel was now bathed in the gem's soft, pervasive light, which pushed back the shadows and revealed a path she had not seen on her frantic way in. It was as if the deep roads themselves were acknowledging her burden, guiding her forward, yet the ease of the path was unnerving. Every step felt observed, and the harmonious hum from her pouch was no longer a private triumph, but a beacon announcing her location to every shadow and every forgotten thing that called these depths home. The very stone beneath her feet seemed to breathe. Where Elara had once struggled through treacherous, static tunnels, the deep roads now shifted around her like a living organism. A wall of collapsed rubble she remembered as impassable now revealed a narrow, cleanly cut passage. A chasm that had forced a long detour was suddenly bridged by a stone arch that rose from the mist with a low, grinding hum. It was as if the mountain itself was clearing a path for her, but the disorienting speed of the transformation was its own kind of trap. She could no longer trust her own memory of this place. The environment was no longer a passive challenge to be overcome. It was an active, sentient participant in her journey, and its intentions were unnervingly ambiguous. Were these changes a form of aid, or a more complex and subtle obstacle? She soon reached a familiar junction, a place where she had once hesitated for hours studying her lost journal. Now, two paths lay open. One was the logical route from her memory, a wide, well-trodden corridor that she knew eventually led back toward the Great Hall. The other was a new, spiraling stairway that descended into a darkness that seemed to swallow the light, a path that had certainly not been there before. As she stood at the crossroads, the three components in her pouch flared in unison, their harmonic hum intensifying, pulling her attention insistently toward the new, dark stairwell. The logical path felt safe, known. The other felt like a leap of faith into the mountain's own design. With a deep breath, she chose to trust the artifacts. She stepped onto the descending stair, and as she did, the wide corridor behind her shimmered and dissolved back into solid rock, the choice made irrevocable. This was not just a test of her courage, but of her willingness to surrender to the will of the roads themselves. Every helpful shift, every open passage, was a question posed by the ancient stone. Was she a worthy bearer, or just another treasure hunter? The stakes were no longer just about her survival, or even the artifact's power. The sentient awakening of the entire network suggested that the reunification of the Star Heart would not simply restore a relic, it would reanimate a civilization's soul, and she was being judged as the one who would hold the key. The spiral stair deposited her not in another forgotten cavern, but directly before a seamless, obsidian wall she had passed a dozen times before. Now, however, a grand, arched entrance was open, its edges glowing with the same soft light as the components. She had been led unerringly back to the Forge of Unity. Stepping inside, the chamber was transformed. The crystalline veins in the dome above pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, like a sleeping giant's heartbeat. And there, in the center of it all, the dark obsidian anvil no longer slept. It throbbed with a soft, inviting luminescence, a silent summons for the final, terrifying step. The journey through the awakened roads had been the examination. Now, the true trial was about to begin. Her hands trembled as she laid the three components upon the obsidian anvil. The star shard, the warm orb, and the luminous gem did not simply rest there. They slid toward one another as if drawn by an irresistible gravity, their edges flowing and merging like liquid light. A low, resonant hum filled the chamber, building into a chord of pure power that vibrated in her teeth and bones. Then, in a silent flash of incandescent white, the three became one. Resting on the anvil was a perfect, star-shaped key, its intricate metalwork glowing with the combined energy of creation, memory, and spirit. The Forge of Unity answered. The crystalline dome above blazed like a captured sun, and the veins of light in the walls pulsed with a frantic, joyous rhythm. Throughout the deep roads, a wave of energy surged through dormant conduits. Distant chambers flooded with light for the first time in millennia, and ghostly, holographic records flickered to life, replaying fragments of a lost golden age. But this reawakening came with a price. A deep, grinding roar echoed from the chamber's perimeter as a section of the wall detached itself. Stone grated against stone, reshaping and rising into a hulking, humanoid form, a guardian construct, its single eye a blazing red gem, its purpose clear in its aggressive, lumbering advance. It was the final, physical test of her worthiness. The chamber itself began to rebel against the sudden influx of power. The floor shuddered violently, and chunks of rock broke free from the ceiling, crashing down around her. She was trapped between a crumbling room and an unyielding sentinel. To flee was to abandon the artifact and her entire quest. To fight this thing with her bare hands was suicide. Her eyes darted to the forge's controls, a complex panel of crystal levers now glowing with frantic energy, but deciphering it would take time she did not have. There was only one choice, a terrifying leap of faith. She snatched the star key from the anvil. It was warm and alive in her hand, and she could feel its immense power humming just beneath the surface. As the guardian lunged, its stone fist swinging toward her, she did not try to block the blow. Instead, she raised the key, not as a shield, but as a conduit. She focused every ounce of her will, her intent not on destruction, but on connection. She poured her hope, her respect for the lost dwarves, and her pure desire to understand their legacy into the artifact. The key erupted. A wave of pure, white energy, gentle yet immense, flowed from the star and enveloped the stone guardian. The construct froze mid-strike, its red eye flickering from crimson to a soft azure blue. The tremors in the chamber ceased. Then, with a deep, resonant bow, the guardian lowered its massive head in a gesture of submission and respect. Its purpose was fulfilled. It turned, its stone arm extending to point toward the far wall of the chamber, where a seamless archway now glowed with a soft, inviting light, a path that had been hidden until this very moment. The way forward was open, not to an exit, but to the true heart of the mystery. The archway did not lead to another tunnel, but into the heart of the mountain itself. Elara stepped into a perfect, circular chamber, its walls smooth and dark. In the center, a pool of water glowed with a soft, ethereal blue light, and floating serenely above it was the star heart. It was not a weapon of sharp angles and menacing power, but a complex, crystalline orb that pulsed with a gentle, rhythmic light, like a sleeping heart. Before she could take another step, the visions struck. They were not images seen with the eyes, but experiences felt in the soul. She felt the collective joy of the dwarves at their peak, the warmth of their forges, the pride in their creations. Then came the schism, a cold, sharp pain of betrayal that fractured the one mind of the people into 1,000 warring shards. She experienced the grief of the final exodus, not as a historical event, but as a personal, devastating loss, the weight of 1,000,000 sorrows pressing down on her. The star heart was not a source of destructive energy. It was a library, an empathic recorder, a tool designed to share not just information, but understanding. Its purpose was to heal, to broadcast the lost history and the true cause of the collapse to any dwarven kin who might still live, reuniting them not by force, but by shared memory and remorse. The realization was a crushing blow to her own ambition. She had risked everything, believing she would uncover a powerful relic that would make her name legendary in the halls of scholars. Now she understood that her personal glory was the most insignificant part of this equation. To claim the artifact as a trophy would be to repeat the very sin of covetousness that had shattered this civilization. The choice was agonizingly clear. She could take the star heart and leave, securing her own legacy while leaving a broken people to their fate. Or she could complete the work the ancients had begun, activating the artifact for its true purpose and sacrificing any personal claim to it, becoming a nameless footnote in the history she helped to mend. Her hand, which had trembled with the desire to possess, now steadied. She reached out, not to grab, but to touch the floating crystal with an open palm, pouring her intent into it. She chose to be a conduit, not an owner. A wave of pure, white light erupted from the star heart, not a destructive blast, but a wave of information, a song of reconciliation that pulsed through the stone, traveling along the ancient pathways of the deep roads, seeking any listening ear of dwarf kind. For a moment, a profound peace filled the chamber. Then, the mountain answered with a different kind of energy. The ground shuddered violently, and a new, deeper rumble echoed from the depths, a sound of rock grinding against rock, with a fury that felt ancient and hungry. The peaceful light of the artifact now shone like a beacon in the dark, and it was clear that something that had slept for ages was now very, very awake. The floor of the chamber buckled, splitting open with a roar of tortured stone. From the widening fissure, a shape began to rise, a creature of living rock and ancient malice. It was a behemoth, its body a jagged mountain of granite plates, and in the center of its mass, a single, baleful eye of molten orange, burned with a hatred as old as the deep roads themselves. This was no mere beast. It was a final, furious guardian, a warden of silence awakened by the artifact's song of hope. Its massive limb, more a slab of mountain than an arm, swung toward her, and Elara threw herself sideways, the impact sending shockwaves through the ground where she had stood just a moment before. The star heart pulsed erratically, its gentle light now a frantic beacon that seemed to enrage the creature further. She could not fight this thing. Its very presence was an earthquake, and the chamber groaned in protest, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. To stand her ground was to be pulverized, and to risk the artifact being shattered in the chaos. Her only choice was to run, to become the lure, and to draw this ancient fury away from the fragile heart of the Dwarven legacy. She snatched the glowing star heart from the air, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold dread coiling in her stomach, and she fled. The creature bellowed, a sound like continents grinding together, and gave chase. Its pursuit was a relentless demolition, pillars shattering and walls crumbling under its bulk as it carved a new, destructive path through the forge. Elara's mind raced, her eyes scanning the frantic, pulsing light of the chamber for anything that could serve as a momentary barrier. She focused her will on the artifact, not to attack, but to plead. As another stone fist descended toward her, she thrust the star heart forward, and a dome of shimmering energy erupted around her, a fragile shield woven from memory and light. The creature's blow crashed against it, and the shield held for a precious second, long enough for her to dive clear before it flickered and died. The effort left her dizzy, the artifact's light dimming slightly. It was a tool of connection, not a weapon, and using it for defense was draining its very essence. She could not do that again. The stakes were no longer just her life, but the preservation of the hope she had just unleashed into the world. As she sprinted through the grand archway, back into the familiar halls of the forge, her gaze caught on a dark, narrow opening high on the wall, almost hidden behind a cascading mineral formation. It was a maintenance shaft, a remnant of the dwarves' ingenious engineering, far too small for the colossal creature. It was her only chance. With a final surge of speed, she leaped, her fingers finding a handhold on the rough stone, and she hauled herself up into the tight, vertical shaft, the creature's enraged roar echoing from below as it found its path blocked. The air in the maintenance shaft was thick with dust and the scent of her own fear. Elara squeezed upward, her back scraping against the rough-hewn stone, the star heart clutched tightly in one hand. Its soft light was her only guide in the absolute blackness, revealing a labyrinth of tight turns and sudden drops. Below, the enraged creature slammed its bulk against the opening, and the entire shaft shuddered. A rain of gravel became a cascade of fist-sized rocks, one striking her shoulder with a sharp, bruising impact. She pushed on, her lungs burning, the sound of grinding stone echoing just behind her heels. At a narrow fork, one passage felt cooler, a faint draft hinting at a larger space beyond. The other passage thrummed with a deep, resonant hum that made the star heart in her hand pulse in warm, sympathetic rhythm. The logical choice was the air, the promise of open space, but the artifact had guided her true this far. Trusting its silent call over her own instinct, she turned into the humming tunnel. The moment she did, a violent crash echoed from the shaft she had rejected, followed by the roar of a full collapse. She had chosen correctly, but the victory was fleeting. The creature, thwarted, began to dig, its claws tearing at the rock with a sound that promised a slow and crushing end. She scrambled forward, the shaft narrowing until she was forcing herself through a final, suffocatingly tight crack. She tumbled out into a wide, silent hallway, landing hard on the smooth stone floor. As she gasped for breath, a final, tremendous roar was cut short by the sound of the mountain sealing itself. The crack she had emerged from was gone, filled in by a solid wall of fallen rock. The forge, its guardians, and all the knowledge within were now permanently entombed behind her. The loss was a hollow ache in her chest, a library of history now locked away forever, but she was alive, and the star heart was safe. In the profound quiet of the new hall, its erratic pulsing finally stilled. The light emanating from the crystal softened into a steady, gentle glow, and as she held it before her, she saw that the light was no longer diffused. It was projecting a distinct, unwavering beam down the hallway, pointing like a compass needle into the darkness. The message had been sent. Now, the artifact itself was becoming a guide, leading her not just to an exit, but perhaps toward the very ears it was meant to find. The star's light was no longer a simple glow, but a purposeful guide, its beam unwavering as it lit a path through corridors she had never seen. The oppressive darkness that had once felt like a physical weight was now held at bay by the artifact's gentle radiance, and as she walked, something miraculous began to happen. Where the light touched the walls, ancient runes shimmered into view, not as warnings or puzzles, but as messages of hope. They were left by the last of the Dwarven lore keepers, a final testament for any worthy enough to follow the light. The script spoke of safe passages and clean water sources, and it provided a simplified, mental map of the upper roads, a gift of knowledge that felt like a warm hand on her shoulder after a long and lonely journey. This was not a test of survival, but a final act of trust from a lost people. The runes led her to a vast, cylindrical shaft, its walls lined with intricate gears and counterweights made of a dark, untarnished metal. In the center stood a platform, a dwarven elevator, its mechanics preserved in perfect, silent readiness. It was her way out, a direct path to the surface world she had almost forgotten. Yet, the sheer convenience of it set her nerves on edge. After so many traps and trials, this smooth, guided passage felt like a different kind of trap altogether, one of complacency. The star heart pulsed warmly in her hands, its light a constant reminder that she carried not just a key to the past, but a temptation that had shattered a kingdom. Could this easy exit be a final, subtle examination of her intent, to see if she would grow careless when her goal was finally in sight? She approached the elevator with a cautious deliberation, her eyes scanning the platform for any sign of decay or tampering. She tested its stability with her weight, listening for any groan of protesting metal, but it was as solid as the day it was forged. The choice was clear. She could reject this gift and spend weeks, perhaps months, searching for another route through the treacherous upper tunnels, risking the artifact to the unknown dangers that still lurked. Or she could trust the guidance of the runes and the will of the roads, stepping onto the platform and accepting the responsibility that came with this swift return. Taking a steadying breath, she chose trust. She found the central control lever and pulled it. With a deep, resonant hum, the great machine awoke. The ascent was unnervingly smooth, a quiet glide upward that felt nothing like her brutal journey into the depths. As the elevator rose, a new sensation washed over her. A faint, golden light began to filter down from above, growing steadily brighter. It was daylight, a stark and almost painful contrast to the monochrome world of stone and crystal she had inhabited for so long. Then came the sounds, faint at first, then unmistakable, the distant cry of a bird, the rustle of wind through leaves. These were the noises of the world she had left behind, a world that had no idea what she now carried in her hands. The ease of her escape did not feel like a victory, but a solemn passing of the torch. Her relationship with the deep roads had fundamentally changed. She was no longer an intruder, but a successor, and the true weight of her journey was only just beginning. The sun was a physical shock, a brilliant, painful warmth on her skin after the cool timelessness of the deep. Elara stumbled from the hidden exit, a simple crack in a mountainside now curtained with flowering vines, and fell to her knees on soft grass. She breathed in the scent of pine and damp earth, a symphony of life that made the silent stone halls feel like a distant dream. In her hands, the star heart's radiant beam faded, its light receding to a soft, rhythmic pulse, like a quiet heartbeat settling into a new rhythm. It no longer felt like a separate object, but an extension of her own will, its purpose now intertwined with her own. She was not its owner, but its guardian, its speaker. Her body ached with a bone-deep exhaustion, but her mind was clearer than it had ever been, filled with the echoes of a million lives and the weight of a single, crucial message. The transition from the deliberate, engineered world below to the wild, untamed surface was jarring. Every bird call was a potential alarm, every rustle in the undergrowth a threat. She had to reorient herself, to remember how to exist in a world of sun and wind and chance. She could return to her old life, to the quiet cartographer's studio. She could hide the artifact, keep its power and its secrets for herself, a legendary discovery that would make her famous in every scholarly circle. But the memory of the final Dwarven king's grief, felt as keenly as her own, made the idea feel like a betrayal. The artifact was not meant for a display case. It was a voice for the voiceless, a chance to mend a broken world. The choice was no choice at all. She would find the dwarf clans. Her quest was no longer about discovery, but about delivery. The stakes had transformed completely. She was no longer an adventurer seeking a forgotten truth, but a messenger carrying a fragile hope. Would the clans hear the artifact's song of unity, or would they see it as a weapon to be fought over, reigniting the very wars that had doomed their ancestors? The weight of that history settled on her shoulders, a burden far heavier than any pack. Pulling her worn cloak tight, she oriented herself toward the nearest rumored settlement and began to walk. She had taken only a dozen steps when she froze, Movement flickered at the edge of the tree line, not the random sway of branches, but the deliberate, solid forms of figures emerging from the shadows. They were dwarves, their bearded faces set in grim, determined lines, their hands resting on the hafts of well-worn axes. They did not look surprised. They looked as if they had been waiting for a very, very long time. The dwarves did not speak, their silence more unnerving than any challenge. Their leader, a scout with a braided gray beard and eyes that held the weight of centuries, stepped forward. His gaze was not on Elara, but on the star heart pulsing softly in her hands. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture not of threat, but of profound recognition. They had felt its awakening in the stone, a tremor in their very bones, and had received fragmented echoes of its broadcast, a ghost song of a past they thought lost forever. With a quiet gesture, the scouts formed a respectful escort, leading her not as a prisoner, but as a long-awaited guest, toward their hidden settlement. The chieftain's hall was carved into the heart of a living mountain, a space of simple, sturdy grandeur. The chieftain herself, a formidable dwarf woman named Kaelin, listened to Elara's story with an intensity that seemed to absorb every word, every pause, every unspoken fear. Elara held nothing back. She spoke of the crumbling bridge and the lost journal, of the whispering stones and the judgment of the kings, laying her entire arduous journey bare before them. Then came the moment of ultimate choice. She could cling to the artifact, the source of all her suffering and triumph, as a final safeguard for her own legacy. Or she could complete the act of trust she had begun in the heart of the mountain. Without hesitation, she extended the star heart toward Chieftain Kaelin, placing the glowing crystal into the dwarf's calloused, waiting hands. It was a gesture that silenced the hall. This act of pure faith did not dissolve all opposition. From the shadows at the edge of the hall, an older dwarf, with a deeply lined face and arms crossed over his chest, spoke, his voice a low rumble of discontent. Why should an outsider, a child of the sun, be the one to return their soul to them? What if this was not a gift, but a clever ploy, the first move in a new game of conquest? The tension was a physical thing, a wall of ancient suspicion that Elara's words alone could not dismantle. Her entire credibility and the fragile hope of reconciliation hung in the balance. Chieftain Kaelin's decision was swift and bold. She would convene a council of all the scattered clans, using the Star Heart not as a prize, but as a focal point for a conversation that had been delayed for 1,000 years. Messengers were dispatched, and within days, the great hall began to fill with dwarves from distant holds, their attire and accents marking generations of separation. As the council gathered, the artifact was placed upon a central stone pedestal. The moment it touched the stone, its gentle pulse intensified. A wave of soft, warm light spread from it, washing over every dwarf in the room. It was not a blinding glare, but an illuminating embrace. The light touched their eyes, and for a single breathless moment, the entire hall fell into a profound and absolute silence, a silent dialogue of shared memory and long-forgotten kinship beginning to unfold. Silence held the hall for a long moment after the light faded, a deep and collective breath held by 100 souls. Then, Chieftain Kaelin gestured for Elara to speak. Stepping forward, her voice carried not with the confidence of a conqueror, but with the quiet conviction of a witness. She did not speak of treasure or power. She spoke of the whispering walls that wept with ancient grief, and of the final, agonizing choice of the last king to seal the great forges rather than let their creation become a weapon for civil war. She recounted the vision of the schism not as a historical fact, but as a visceral, shared pain, a fracture that had echoed through the stone for generations. Her testimony was a mirror, reflecting a history they all knew in fragments, but had never felt as one. The star heart on its pedestal pulsed in soft agreement, its empathetic energy weaving her words into the very air, allowing the clan leaders to feel the truth of her journey as if it were their own memory. Hardened faces, set in lines of old suspicion, began to soften. A chieftain from the northern clans, known for his isolationism, slowly unclenched a fist he had held tight for decades. The artifact was not demanding unity, it was offering understanding, and that was a language even the most stubborn could comprehend. Yet, old wounds run deep. As the initial wave of shared emotion subsided, the practical realities of centuries of separation surfaced. Debates erupted over borders, mining rights, and ancient slights, forgotten by all but the clan historians. An elder from the eastern hold stood, his voice a low rumble of discontent, questioning the wisdom of trusting an outsider's vision over their own long-held traditions. Elara found herself navigating a delicate political landscape, her neutrality her only asset. She did not advocate for one clan over another. Instead, she reframed their arguments, reminding them that the Deep Roads themselves had judged her worthy, not by her bloodline, but by her intent, and that the same principle could guide them now. She became a bridge, not a ruler, gently steering conversations away from blame and toward the shared legacy depicted in the stone murals she described. When the debates reached a fever pitch, she would simply ask, what would the founders, who laid the first stone with a mason's trowel, think of this division? The question, echoing the trial of the Hall of Ancestors, often brought a chastened quiet. After days of intense discussion, a tentative accord was drafted, the first of its kind in 1,000 years. It was fragile, a sapling in stony ground, but it was alive. It promised open trade routes, shared stewardship of the reawakened Deep Roads, and a permanent council to mediate disputes. As the clan leaders prepared to depart, Chieftain Kalen turned to Elara. The dwarves owed her a debt that could never be repaid, she said, but they would ask for one more thing. Would she stay, not as a guest, but as an advisor? Her unique understanding of their history and her neutral perspective were assets they desperately needed to nurture this fragile new piece. The choice was a fork in the road of her own life. She could return to the sunlit world, to the quiet solitude of her maps, her legendary discovery, a private, completed chapter. Or she could step fully into this new world of stone and politics, tying her fate to a people at their most vulnerable and hopeful moment. She thought of her journal, lost to the abyss, and realized her old life was already a relic. Her true work was here. She agreed to stay, not permanently, but for as long as her guidance was needed to see the First Unity efforts take root. The success of this council had already begun to reshape the region, its implications rippling out toward the human kingdoms that had long believed the dwarves a dying, fractured race. Elara's decision to remain made her a part of that change, her personal future now inextricably linked to the collective future she had helped to forge. After the hall emptied, the star heart was enshrined in a place of honor, its soft light a constant reminder of the peace it represented. Elara was given quarters carved into the mountain nearby, and there, surrounded by the first recovered records from the deep roads, she began her new work. With a scholar's patience and a storyteller's heart, she started the slow, meticulous process of translation, determined to ensure that this time the legends would not be forgotten, but would become the foundation of a new and united age. The work of translation became its own kind of deep road, a labyrinth of language and memory. Elara spent her days in a chamber filled with recovered stone tablets and crystalline data shards, her mind a living bridge between the ancient Dwarven script and the common tongue. She meticulously transcribed the intricate schematics for self-replenishing aquifers and the architectural principles behind the self-supporting arches of the great halls. These were not just historical curiosities, they were blueprints for a future. Dwarven engineers, using her translations, began constructing new, safer mine supports that dramatically reduced cave-ins, and they revived the art of crafting resonance crystals that could detect unstable rock formations long before they threatened to collapse. This practical application of forgotten knowledge fostered a cultural renaissance, strengthening the fledgling unity with tangible, life-saving results. Yet, not every recovered truth was a comfortable one. Some tablets contained stark records of the schism, detailing the pride and stubbornness of clan lords who had prioritized their own glory over the collective good. These translations were met with resistance from traditionalists who saw them as an outsider, airing dirty laundry, a deliberate attempt to shame their ancestors and undermine their authority. Minor conflicts simmered in council meetings, testing the fragile peace. Elara realized that simply delivering the words was not enough. She had to deliver the context, the humanity behind the failures. To do this, she had to be more than a translator. She had to be a part of the community. She made a conscious decision to step away from her desk. She began sharing meals in the common halls, listening to clan gossip and old ballads, and even learning the basics of stone shaping. She shared stories of her own journey, not as a grand adventure, but as a series of humbling mistakes and hard-won lessons. This integration built a foundation of personal trust that her scholarly work alone could never achieve. The dwarves began to see her not as a human envoy, but as Elara, the one who had walked their lost roads and carried their sorrows back to them. This trust allowed the more difficult historical truths to be heard not as accusations, but as cautionary tales from a shared past, mistakes that must be acknowledged to avoid repeating them. As her reputation as both a scholar and a trusted friend grew, a group of young dwarves, their eyes alight with a curiosity she recognized from her own youth, approached her. They had heard her tales of the Hall of Ancestors and the silent, glowing grottos, and they were eager to see these wonders for themselves. They asked if she would guide them into the safer, stabilized sections of the deep roads. Their request sparked a powerful idea. The knowledge she was recovering was not meant to be locked away in new archives. It was meant to be lived. The future of the Dwarven legacy depended not on a single human translator, but on a new generation who understood both its glory and its peril. She saw in their eager faces the potential for a new kind of guardian, one armed not with axes against forgotten beasts, but with understanding and respect for the profound history sleeping in the stone. Training them would be the most important translation of all, turning written words into lived experience and ensuring the legends of the deep would never be lost again. The first expedition was a quiet procession into memory. Elara led a handful of young dwarves into the stabilized upper halls, their faces a mixture of awe and nervous energy. She taught them to read the subtle language of the stone, to identify the sound of stable granite versus the whisper of a crumbling fissure. They learned to trace the faded runes not as dead letters, but as the voices of their own ancestors, mapping not just geography, but the rise and fall of a civilization. For these youths, the Deep Roads transformed from a place of fearful legend into a library of their own identity. The success of that first journey ignited a fire. The young dwarves, inspired, proposed the formation of a new guild, the Deep Wardens, dedicated to the preservation and study of their reclaimed heritage. Yet this new vision was met with caution from some of the elders. They saw only the ghosts of past collapses and the ever-present danger of the unstable depths, fearing that encouraging such exploration was an invitation to disaster. Elara understood their fear, for she had lived it. She did not dismiss their concerns, but instead presented a detailed plan, showcasing the modern safety protocols, the mapped and stabilized routes, and the rigorous training she would implement. She argued that the greatest danger was not in a carefully managed return, but in allowing their history to be forgotten a second time, leaving it to crumble into myth and dust. The true test of her philosophy came when a sharp-eyed young dwarf named Kalen, named for the chieftain, became fixated on a sealed tunnel marked with ancient warnings. He saw not a barrier, but a mystery, a challenge to his burgeoning skills. The old Elara might have simply forbidden it, reinforcing the rule with stern authority. But the guardian she had become saw a different path. She gathered the young wardens before the sealed archway. She did not simply tell them it was dangerous. She showed them, using charcoal and parchment. She had them sketch the hairline fractures around the frame, explaining the physics of a hanging stone ceiling and how a single misplaced step could trigger a chain reaction. She recounted her own near-fatal encounter in the Cavern of Echoing Stone, making the consequence feel immediate and personal. She redirected Kalen's burning curiosity, challenging him to use his mapping skills to theorize what the tunnel might have once contained based on the architecture of the surrounding halls. This approach transformed a rebellious impulse into a scholarly exercise, fostering a respect built on understanding rather than simple obedience. The establishment of the Deep Wardens Guild was a quiet revolution. It ensured the legacy of the Deep Roads would be nurtured by dwarf hands, a living tradition passed to a new generation. It also cemented Elara's influence, her methods and her story woven into the very fabric of their renewed culture. She was preparing the Wardens for their first independent mapping assignment when a runner found her in the guild hall. The young dwarf handed her a sealed scroll case, its parchment crisp and smelling of sun and ink, a stark contrast to the deep scent of stone. It was a message from the surface, from her old cartography guild. They had heard whispers of her unprecedented maps of the lost roads, and they formally requested her return, hoping she would share her knowledge with the wider world. The request lay in her hands, a tangible link to the life she had left behind. She stood at a new crossroads, her heart divided between the sunlit world of her past and the mountain-deep home she had helped to build. The journey back to the surface felt like walking through a forgotten dream. The air grew thinner, the light harsher, and the vibrant, chaotic noise of the human city was a jarring symphony after the deep, resonant quiet of the mountain. Her former colleagues at the Cartography Guild greeted her with a mixture of awe and skepticism, their eyes wide at the mere sight of her, a woman they had given up for lost. They had heard the wild rumors, of course, whispers of glowing artifacts and awakened kingdoms, and they presented her with a formal request. They wanted her expertise to map the newly accessible regions bordering the dwarf territories, to bring clarity to lands that had been marked as unknown for centuries. Elara agreed, but on her own terms. She saw a chance to build a bridge, not just chart a border. She would collaborate, sharing general histories of the land and creating meticulous maps of the surface terrain, the river routes, and the safe mountain passes. This knowledge could foster prosperous trade and build a foundation of mutual understanding between two worlds that had grown distant and suspicious of one another. The tension surfaced quickly. The guild masters, thrilled by the potential, began to press for more. They wanted detailed schematics of the deep roads entrances, the internal layouts of the upper halls, anything that could give them a commercial or strategic advantage. Their requests were wrapped in the language of scholarship, but the underlying hunger for exclusive knowledge was unmistakable. Elara's dual allegiance was stretched taut. She had to protect the dwarves' sacred sites and the locations of their most vulnerable holds, the secrets entrusted to her as a guardian. Yet, she also had to maintain the trust of the guild, or risk having them send their own, less scrupulous explorers into the region. Her decision was a careful negotiation of transparency and protection. She offered them beautifully rendered maps of the surface, enriched with the deep historical context the dwarves had provided about the land itself, why a certain valley was considered sacred, or how an ancient river had shaped trade 1,000 years ago. But she politely, firmly, withheld any details that would lead a curious eye toward a sealed dwarven gate or a hall of ancestral kings. The stakes of her diplomatic dance could not have been higher. A misstep, a single map drawn with too much detail, could lead to cultural exploitation, with human treasure hunters desecrating tombs or mining companies accidentally triggering ancient dwarven defenses. But success promised a new era of alliance, where human ingenuity and dwarven craftsmanship could build something greater than either society could achieve alone. After days of careful negotiation, she secured a formal agreement for respectful, guided exploration, a document that honored the sovereignty of the dwarf holds. The relief was palpable, but it was short-lived. As she prepared to return to the mountain, a guild messenger handed her a sealed letter. It was a request from a powerful noble house, expressing keen interest in the mineral rights to a specific mountain range, a range that housed one of the dwarves' most sacred and secret founding halls. The political game on the surface was only just beginning. Returning to the dwarf hold felt like coming home. The familiar scent of stone dust and forge fire was a comfort, but it was immediately overshadowed by the news that greeted her. Chieftain Kalen met her at the gate, a rare, broad smile on her face. The first joint dwarf-human expedition was being planned, a direct result of Elara's efforts on the surface. It was to be a mapping mission into the lower valleys, a safe and open area designed to build trust through shared work. The very idea was revolutionary. Yet, as Elara looked at the eager faces of the young Deep Wardens selected for the task, she felt a new weight settle on her shoulders. She had successfully navigated the politics of her old world, but now she would have to guide both sides through the far more delicate terrain of their first real steps together. The air within the upper Deep Roads tasted of old stone and nervous excitement. Elara walked a careful line between two groups, her boots echoing in a hall that had not heard a human voice in centuries. The dwarf engineers moved with a quiet, ingrained confidence, their hands instinctively tracing the runes on the walls as they set up resonance lamps. The human scholars, meanwhile, buzzed with a palpable energy, their whispers bouncing off the vaulted ceiling as they unrolled their pristine parchment. A shared goal bound them, but the chasm of mutual suspicion was a fissure just beneath their feet. It first cracked open over a simple mapping technique. A young human cartographer, eager for precision, began hammering a metal spike to anchor his measuring line. A veteran dwarf prospector named Boran was at his side in an instant, his hand covering the hammer before it could strike. "You do not shout in the mountain's ear," he growled, his voice a low rumble of warning. "What you call a measurement, it calls a challenge." The human, affronted, argued for the necessity of accurate data. Elara stepped between them, her own memories of the echoing stone cavern vivid. She explained not just the risk of collapse, but the dwarven reverence for the stone as a living record. She showed the human how to use a weighted string and the natural acoustics, turning a conflict into a lesson in a different kind of listening. This small success was tested days later when they broke into a sealed chamber. Inside were not weapons or gold, but walls covered in intricate celestial charts, carved into polished slate. The human astronomers in the group were spellbound. These were not simple star maps, but a complex record of planetary movements and cosmic cycles observed from deep within the earth, a scientific achievement no one had imagined possible. The discovery was a triumph, but it immediately raised the question of ownership. The dwarves saw it as a sacred piece of their heritage, too precious to be removed. The humans argued that the delicate carvings were deteriorating and needed to be preserved in a surface archive where their full scholarly potential could be realized. The debate threatened to split the expedition. Elara listened to both sides, feeling the weight of the precedent they were setting. She proposed a solution that honored both claims, a rotating custodianship. The artifacts would remain within the mountain for a set period, allowing dwarf lore keepers to study and document them in their original context. Then, they would be carefully transported to the Surface Guild for a matching period of human analysis, with dwarf representatives accompanying them to ensure their safety and proper interpretation. It was a compromise built on shared custody rather than exclusive possession. The success of this first joint venture resonated far beyond the excavated chamber. It proved that two cultures could not only work together, but could achieve something neither could alone, unlocking a forgotten branch of science. The human scholars gained a new, profound respect for dwarven intellect, while the dwarves saw their history validated by the open-mouthed wonder of outsiders. As the expedition packed its findings, Chieftain Kalen found Elara studying the celestial slate one last time. The chieftain's expression was unreadable, her gaze lingering on the human who had not just bridged two worlds, but had taught them how to build a new one together. She extended a formal invitation for a private audience in her chambers that evening, a request that carried the gravity of a turning point, not just for the Alliance, but for the rest of Elara's life. The stone of the chieftain's chamber felt cool against her palm. Elara swore the oath in a clear, steady voice, the ancient words binding her not to a single people, but to the fragile bridge stretching between them. Her promise was to protect the secrets of the Deep Roads and to speak for the Dwarven kingdom in the courts of men. In return, Chieftain Kalen placed a heavy medallion of polished obsidian and silver around her neck, its weight an immediate and constant reminder of the burden she now carried. Her new residence, a set of rooms carved into the mountain near the Great Hall, was more than a home. It was a statement. She was no longer a guest or an advisor, but a permanent fixture, her life physically woven into the stone tapestry of Dwarven society. This honor came with relentless scrutiny. Every decision she made was observed by Dwarven elders wary of an outsider's influence, and by human emissaries who tested the limits of her new authority. She had to prove her loyalty to the dwarves without appearing to abandon her own kind, a diplomatic dance on a knife's edge. Her first major decision was intensely personal, how to divide her very existence. She created a strict schedule, one that became her new law. 10 days of each month were spent in the dwarf hold, immersed in council meetings and the ongoing work with the Deep Wardens. 10 days were allocated for her duties on the surface, meeting with her old guild and human nobles. The remaining days were for travel, for the slow, deliberate journeys between her two worlds. This rigid structure was her shield against accusations of favoritism, a visible demonstration that her allegiance was to the Alliance itself. Her first official act as ambassador was to mediate a dispute over timber rights in the border forests. She stood in a chamber filled with dwarf engineers and human lumber barons, the air thick with the scent of pine resin and suspicion. The humans saw a resource to be harvested for profit. The dwarves saw the ancient, deep-rooted anchors that stabilized the mountain slopes above their sacred halls. Elara listened, her mind translating not just words, but entire worldviews. She proposed a rotational harvesting plan that respected the integrity of the stone while granting the humans access to the timber they needed. It was a compromise that left no one entirely happy, but everyone reluctantly agreeable, the true mark of a successful negotiation. As the final seals were pressed into the clay tablet, a faint, familiar hum resonated through the floor, a gentle vibration that traveled up through the soles of her boots and settled in her bones. It was the star heart, pulsing softly from its shrine in the Great Hall. The artifact was not silent, not dormant. It was a quiet witness, its work of reconciliation continuing through the tedious, unglamorous work of treaties and trade agreements. Through her. Her personal quest had ended, but its purpose had become her life's blood, flowing as steadily and inexorably as the deep currents of the earth itself. The Great Hall thrummed with attention as hard as granite. On one side, the dwarf traditionalists stood, their arms crossed over armored chests, their faces set in lines as unyielding as the mountain itself. Across the chamber, the human envoys shifted nervously in their fine silks, their arguments for expanded mining rights echoing with a hollow ring against the ancient stone. The debate had reached a fever pitch, a whirlwind of accusations and stubborn refusals that threatened to shatter the fragile alliance Elara had worked so hard to build. She stood between them, the polished weight of her ambassadorial medallion, feeling like an anchor, dragging her down into the chasm of their discord. Then, a whisper from the shrine behind her, a soft pulse of light that only she seemed to feel. The star heart was stirring. Its gentle warmth spread through her, not as a command, but as an offer. It was a key, and she was the lock. Closing her eyes, she did not reach for the physical artifact. Instead, she opened her mind, becoming a conduit for the memory it held. The argumentative voices of the hall faded, replaced by a different kind of roar. A wave of spectral light washed from her, engulfing the chamber. The solid stone walls seemed to dissolve, and the great hall was gone. In its place, a vision bloomed around every dwarf and human present. They were no longer observers, they were participants, standing in a grand forge hall of a lost age. They saw dwarf lords, their faces twisted with the same stubborn pride as the traditionalists in the room, arguing over a vein of star metal. They felt the bitter chill of a schism as brothers turned their engineering genius against one another, crafting terrible war machines instead of glorious cities. They witnessed the consequences not as a story, but as a shared, visceral experience. The collapse of a great hall, burying artisans and warriors alike. The slow, agonizing silence as the forges went cold, and the final, sorrowful march into exile. The vision was a hammer blow to the soul. When the light receded and the familiar walls of the great hall solidified around them, the silence was absolute. A veteran dwarf smith, who had moments before been shouting about ancestral rites, slowly lowered his head, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. The lead human envoy, his face pale, unclenched his hands, his ambition for wealth suddenly feeling petty and shameful in the face of such collective loss. The artifact had not taken sides. It had not argued or negotiated. It had simply made them understand. In that shared, profound silence, the true purpose of the Star Heart was finally fulfilled. It was not a treasure to be owned, but a teacher whose lesson was empathy. The debate over mining rights did not just end, it transformed. The dwarves, humbled by the memory of their own past greed, offered guided access to a secondary vein. The humans, understanding the sacred weight of the stone, proposed a partnership where profits would fund the preservation of the deeper, more fragile historical sites. Elara did not need to speak. Her role had shifted once more. She was no longer just a translator of words or a mediator of disputes. She had become the living heart of the renewed legends, the vessel through which the past could gently correct the course of the future. The alliance was no longer a political agreement, but a shared vow, etched not on parchment, but in the memory of a vision they had all witnessed together. The laughter of children drifted up from the courtyard, a bright, tangled melody of high human voices and the deeper, rumbling chuckles of dwarf young. Elara leaned on the carved stone balcony, watching them below. They were chasing a glowing resonance crystal, a toy and a lesson in one. Their game, a living symbol of a world made whole. She saw a young dwarf girl patiently showing a human boy how to listen to the stone, while he, in turn, pointed out the shapes of the clouds drifting past the mountain peaks. This simple, shared play was the true treasure she had unearthed, more valuable than any star-shaped key or crystalline artifact. Her journey had begun with a solitary map and a hunger for forgotten truths, but it had ended here, in the heart of a community, teaching her that the greatest discovery is not what you find, but what you build with it. The Star Heart's power was not in its light, but in its ability to make others feel, to remember a shared past so vividly that it became impossible to repeat its mistakes. She was no longer just a cartographer of places, but a cartographer of connections. Her life's work now the careful, ongoing mapping of trust between two peoples. New challenges would always rise like new mountains on the horizon, disputes over resources, or the slow creep of old prejudices. But the foundation was laid, not in stone and mortar, but in the understanding carried in those laughing voices below. The legends of the Dwarven Deep Roads would never be lost again, not because they were carved in hidden chambers, but because they were now being told in sunlit courtyards, shared in common songs, and lived in the daily lives of a united future. A deep, quiet warmth settled in her chest, a satisfaction that had nothing to do with fame or reward. Her own story, once a single, fragile thread, was now irrevocably woven into the enduring tapestry of the mountains, a permanent and vibrant part of the history she had helped to save.